In a quiet corner of Chicago, where the hum of life buzzes softly against the backdrop of towering buildings and narrow streets, lived Maya Johnson. She was a woman whose strength often went unnoticed by those who passed her by. To the world, she might have seemed like just another face in the crowd, but to her two young children, she was everything: mother, protector, provider, and hero. Maya worked long hours as a nurse at a nearby hospital, her days filled with tending to others while her nights were reserved for her kids. Despite the weight of her responsibilities, she carried herself with grace, always finding small moments of joy: a warm cup of tea after work, laughter shared with her children, or the simple pleasure of watching the sunset from her tiny apartment window. But life wasn't easy for Maya. As a Black single mother, she faced challenges that many couldn't even imagine. There were bills to pay, groceries to stretch, and the constant worry about whether she was doing enough for her family. Yet through it all, she remained hopeful, believing that hard work and kindness would see them through. Her optimism was infectious, lighting up even the darkest corners of her world. Still, there were moments when reality hit hard, reminding her of the invisible barriers society often placed in her path. One such moment came late one evening after a grueling shift at the hospital. Exhausted but relieved to be heading home to her kids, Maya drove carefully along the dimly lit streets. The air was cool, and the city felt unusually calm, almost peaceful. It was then that red and blue lights flashed behind her, breaking the stillness. Her heart sank as she pulled over, dread creeping into her chest. She hadn't been speeding, hadn't run a stop sign, and certainly hadn't broken any laws. So why was she being stopped? When the officer approached her car, his tone was curt, demanding. He claimed her taillight was out, though Maya knew it wasn't true. She had checked it just days ago. Confused and nervous, she tried to explain, but the officer cut her off, his voice sharp and dismissive. His partner lingered nearby, arms crossed, watching silently. Maya's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she reminded herself to stay calm. She thought of her children asleep in the backseat and vowed not to let fear take hold. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, the situation grew more tense. The officer's questions became intrusive, their demeanor increasingly aggressive. They asked where she was coming from, why she was out so late, and whether she had anything illegal in the car. Each question felt heavier than the last, laced with suspicion and judgment. Maya answered politely, trying to diffuse the tension, but nothing seemed to satisfy them. When one of the officers suggested searching her vehicle without cause, panic bubbled beneath her composed exterior. This wasn't right. She hadn't done anything wrong. Why were they treating her this way? As the confrontation dragged on, Maya's mind raced. She thought about calling a lawyer, but who would answer at this hour? Then, an idea struck her. One person who could make things right. Someone who had always been her shield, her rock, no matter what. Her brother, Zeke. He was far away, serving his country in ways most people couldn't comprehend. But if anyone could help her now, it was him. With trembling fingers, she reached for her phone, praying he'd pick up. Little did she know, this call would change everything. For her, for the officers, and for anyone who dared underestimate the bond between siblings. As the seconds ticked by, the tension in the air grew thicker. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as the officers continued their barrage of questions, each one more invasive than the last. Their tone shifted from professional to accusatory, and their body language became increasingly hostile. One officer leaned closer to her window, his voice rising, as he demanded answers she didn't have. The other paced around her car, shining a flashlight into every corner, clearly looking for something, anything, that could justify their suspicions. Maya tried to stay calm, reminding herself that she hadn't done anything wrong. She answered their questions patiently, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. But no matter how polite or cooperative she was, it seemed to make no difference. The officers weren't interested in hearing her side of the story. Instead, they made comments laced with thinly veiled prejudice, questioning why someone like her, a single black mother working late at night, was driving through this part of town. Each word felt like a weight pressing down on her shoulders, chipping away at her dignity. The situation escalated when one of the officers suggested searching her car without probable cause. "We just want to make sure everything's okay," he said, though his tone implied otherwise. Maya knew her rights. She knew they couldn't search her vehicle without consent or a warrant, but standing up for herself felt risky. These were authority figures, armed and intimidating, and she was alone except for her sleeping children in the backseat. Her mind raced as she weighed her options. Should she argue? Comply? Call for help? Her hesitation only fueled their aggression. One officer snapped, "Why are you being so difficult? What do you have to hide?" His words stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed the underlying bias driving their actions. Maya clenched her jaw, fighting back tears. She thought about her kids, sound asleep behind her, oblivious to the chaos unfolding outside. She couldn't let them wake up to this, to see their mother treated this way. She had to protect them, even if it meant swallowing her pride. But the harassment didn't stop there. The officers began making snide remarks, mocking her job as a nurse and implying she must be struggling financially. "Working nights, huh? Must be tough," one of them sneered, his smirk cutting deeper than any insult. Maya wanted to scream, to tell them how hard she worked, how much she sacrificed every single day to give her children a better life. But she bit her tongue, knowing that reacting emotionally would only make things worse. As the confrontation dragged on, Maya's fear turned into frustration, and then anger. This wasn't justice, it was bullying. And yet, what could she do? She was outnumbered, outmatched, and powerless against their badges and guns. For the first time that night, doubt crept into her mind. Would anyone believe her if she reported this? Would anyone care? That's when she remembered Zeke, her big brother, her protector, the person who had always stood between her and the world's cruelty. Zeke wasn't just family. He was a force to be reckoned with, a man whose reputation commanded respect, even in the highest echelons of power. If anyone could put an end to this nightmare, it was him. With shaking hands, Maya reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found his name. Her finger hovered over the call button for a moment as doubt flickered again. It was the middle of the night where he was stationed overseas. Would he even answer? And if he did, would he be able to help from so far away? But then she remembered something Zeke had told her years ago. "No matter where I am, no matter what I'm doing, you come first. Always." Taking a deep breath, she pressed the call button and held the phone to her ear. As it rang, she prayed silently, hoping against hope that her brother would pick up. Little did she know, this call would set off a chain of events that neither the officers nor anyone else could have anticipated. The phone rang twice, each tone stretching out like an eternity in Maya's ears. Her heart raced as she glanced nervously at the officers, who were now circling her car with growing impatience. One of them tapped on her window again, his voice sharp and demanding. "Who are you calling? Put the phone down." Maya ignored him, her focus entirely on the call. She couldn't afford to lose this lifeline. Not now, not when she felt so powerless. On the third ring, the line clicked, and a deep, familiar voice answered. "Maya, everything okay?" It was Zeke, even half a world away. His tone carried the same calm authority that had always made her feel safe. Hearing his voice instantly steadied her trembling hands, but the weight of the situation crashed over her all at once. Tears welled up in her eyes as she struggled to find the words. "Zeke," she whispered, her voice cracking under the strain. I need your help. I'm in trouble." There was a pause on the other end, brief but heavy. When Zeke spoke again, his voice was sharper, more urgent. "What kind of trouble? Are you hurt? Where are you?" Maya took a shaky breath, trying to explain without breaking down completely. I'm pulled over by some cops. They're saying my taillight is out, but it's not true. They're being really aggressive, Zeke. They won't leave me alone, and they're threatening to search the car. I don't know what to do." Another pause followed, but this one was different. This time, it wasn't concern, it was calculation. Zeke's mind was already working, piecing together the details of what she'd said and formulating a plan. His voice softened slightly, though it still carried an edge of steel. "Okay, listen to me carefully, Maya. Stay calm. Don't say anything else to them unless you have to. Do you understand?" She nodded, then realized he couldn't see her. "Yes," she whispered. "Good. Now tell me exactly where you are. Give me the street name, the cross streets, everything. And keep your phone close. I'll handle this." Maya quickly rattled off the location, her voice steadying as she focused on giving him the information he needed. As she spoke, she noticed one of the officers glaring at her through the window, clearly irritated that she was on the phone. She turned her body slightly, shielding the screen from view as best she could. The last thing she wanted was for them to realize who she was talking to. When she finished, Zeke's tone shifted again, this time colder and more resolute. "Stay put, Maya. Don't let them intimidate you. Help is coming." There was no mistaking the promise in his voice. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a guarantee. For the first time since the stop, Maya felt a flicker of hope. Whatever happened next, she knew Zeke wouldn't let her face it alone. After hanging up, Maya sat quietly, clutching the phone in her lap. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. One of them leaned closer to the window again, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Calling your lawyer, or maybe your boyfriend. Doesn't matter. You're wasting time." Maya didn't respond. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her jaw set. She didn't owe these men anything, not explanations, not apologies, and certainly not fear. Zeke's words echoed in her mind. "Help is coming." She repeated them silently to herself, clinging to the promise like a lifeline. Unbeknownst to the officers, Zeke was already moving. From his base overseas, he began pulling strings with the precision of a man who had spent years mastering the art of strategy. He contacted trusted allies within the military and government, using his rank and reputation to expedite action. Within minutes, he had pinpointed Maya's exact location and initiated a series of calls that would bring the full weight of his influence crashing down on the scene. Back in Chicago, the officers continued their verbal assault, oblivious to the storm brewing in the distance. To them, Maya was just another civilian, someone they could push around without consequence. But they had no idea who they were dealing with, or rather, who Maya's brother was. And soon enough, they would learn that crossing the wrong person can have consequences far beyond what they could ever imagine. As Maya waited, her mind drifted to memories of Zeke growing up. The way he'd always shielded her from bullies, stood up for her when others tried to tear her down. He had been her hero then, and he was her hero now. Whatever came next, she knew one thing for certain. Her brother wouldn't stop until justice was served. It didn't take long for the first sign of Zeke's intervention to appear. Less than 30 minutes after Maya's call, the distant hum of an engine broke through the tense silence of the quiet street. The sound grew louder, sharper, until a sleek black SUV screeched to a halt just behind the police cruiser. Its arrival was sudden and commanding, drawing the attention of everyone present, including the officers who had been so focused on harassing Maya. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Ezekiel Zeke Johnson. Even in civilian clothes, a plain black jacket, dark jeans, and sturdy boots, he exuded an aura of authority that demanded respect. Standing well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a posture honed by years of military discipline, Zeke cut an imposing figure. His face was calm but unreadable, his piercing eyes scanning the scene with precision. For a moment, no one spoke. The officers froze mid-motion, their earlier bravado faltering as they took in the man before them. Zeke didn't rush. He moved deliberately, closing the distance between himself and the group. When he reached Maya's car, he bent down slightly to look at her through the window. His expression softened instantly, concern replacing the steely resolve he'd worn moments ago. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his voice firm yet gentle. Maya nodded, relief washing over her features. Just seeing him there made her feel safer, stronger. Straightening up, Zeke turned his attention to the officers. He introduced himself calmly, though there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. "Commander Ezekiel Johnson," he said, his tone even but carrying an unspoken authority. "Delta Force. Mind telling me what's going on here?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances. At first, they seemed unsure how to respond. One of them, clearly trying to regain control of the situation, stepped forward and began explaining their version of events. They mentioned the supposed broken taillight, claimed Maya had been acting suspiciously, and justified their decision to search the vehicle. But as they spoke, Zeke listened intently, his sharp gaze never wavering. It was clear he wasn't buying their story. When they finished, Zeke didn't raise his voice or make accusations. Instead, he asked pointed questions, questions that revealed holes in their narrative. Had they actually tested the taillight? Did they have probable cause to search the car? Why had they escalated the situation unnecessarily? Each query was delivered with surgical precision, forcing the officers to stumble over their answers. Their earlier confidence crumbled under the pressure of Zeke's unwavering scrutiny. As the conversation continued, Zeke subtly dropped hints about his background and connections. He mentioned his current deployment status, casually referenced high-ranking officials he worked alongside, and emphasized the seriousness of misconduct involving someone connected to the U.S. military. The officer's body language shifted noticeably. They straightened up, avoided eye contact, and began speaking in shorter, more cautious sentences. They realized too late that they weren't dealing with an ordinary civilian. They were facing someone whose influence reached far beyond their jurisdiction. Meanwhile, Maya watched silently from her car, marveling at her brother's composure. She knew Zeke could be intimidating when he wanted to be, but this was different. This wasn't about fear. It was about accountability. He wasn't threatening the officers outright, but his mere presence forced them to confront the reality of their actions. Every word he spoke carried the implicit promise that this wouldn't end here. If they thought they could intimidate his sister without consequences, they were gravely mistaken. By the time Zeke concluded his questioning, the officers were visibly shaken. One of them muttered something about needing to check their records and retreated to their cruiser, while the other stood awkwardly nearby, avoiding further engagement. The shift in power dynamics was undeniable. What had started as a hostile confrontation had transformed into a stark reminder of who held the upper hand. And it wasn't the men in uniform anymore. Zeke turned back to Maya, placing a reassuring hand on the roof of her car. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "But you're safe now. Let's get you home." For the first time that night, Maya allowed herself to breathe deeply. The storm wasn't fully over, but she knew Zeke wouldn't stop until justice was served, not just for her, but for anyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation. And as the SUV pulled away from the curb, the officers were left standing in stunned silence, realizing they had underestimated the wrong person. The next morning, the quiet neighborhood where Maya lived buzzed with whispers. Word had spread quickly about what happened the night before, how a routine traffic stop had turned into something far more intense, thanks to the unexpected arrival of a man whose reputation preceded him. Neighbors who barely knew Maya began stopping by her apartment, curious but also supportive. Some brought food, others offered kind words, and a few even shared their own stories of run-ins with law enforcement. It was as if Zeke's intervention hadn't just changed Maya's life. It had sparked a ripple effect, reminding everyone that standing up against injustice could inspire others to do the same. Meanwhile, Zeke wasted no time in ensuring accountability. After leaving the scene, he made several calls, leveraging his high-level connections within both the military and government. He reached out to contacts in federal agencies, requesting an immediate investigation into the officer's conduct. His tone during these conversations was calm but firm, leaving no room for hesitation or pushback. "This isn't personal," he explained to one official over the phone. "But when people abuse their power, it undermines trust in the system. That's not something we can ignore." By midday, Internal Affairs had launched a formal inquiry into the incident. The two officers involved were suspended pending further review, their actions scrutinized under a microscope. Investigators combed through body cam footage, dash cam recordings, and witness statements, piecing together exactly what had transpired. What they found only confirmed Maya's account. There was no broken taillight, no probable cause for a search, and plenty of evidence pointing to racial profiling. The case became a priority, drawing attention from higher-ups who recognized its potential to highlight systemic issues within the department. Zeke didn't stop there. Knowing how stressful legal battles could be, especially for someone like Maya, who was already juggling so much, he arranged for top-tier legal support. A team of attorneys specializing in civil rights cases took on her case pro bono, ensuring she wouldn't face any charges stemming from the incident. They also helped her file a complaint against the officers, detailing every instance of misconduct and demanding compensation for emotional distress. With Zeke overseeing everything behind the scenes, Maya felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. For once, she wasn't fighting alone. Back at home, Maya struggled to process everything that had happened. On one hand, she was grateful for Zeke's intervention. On the other, she couldn't shake the frustration of needing her brother, a decorated soldier, to step in just to receive fair treatment. She thought about all the people who didn't have someone like Zeke in their corner. What happened to them when they were wrongfully targeted? Did anyone listen to their stories? These questions gnawed at her, fueling a growing determination to use her experience to make a difference. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table with Zeke, she voiced her thoughts. "I don't want this to end here," she said firmly. "What happened to me isn't unique. People need to know about it. They need to see that change is possible." Zeke nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he replied. "Your story has power. If you're willing to share it, I'll make sure your voice is heard. But it's your call, Maya. You've been through enough already." Maya hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "If telling my story can help even one person feel less alone, then it's worth it." With Zeke's guidance, Maya began reaching out to local advocacy groups and community leaders. Together, they planned a series of events aimed at raising awareness about racial profiling and police misconduct. Flyers went up around the neighborhood, social media posts gained traction, and soon, people from all walks of life started showing interest. Maya's courage inspired others to come forward with their own experiences, creating a groundswell of support and solidarity. As the days passed, Maya realized something important. While Zeke had played a crucial role in resolving her immediate crisis, the real work was just beginning. Justice wasn't just about holding individuals accountable. It was about addressing the deeper systemic issues that allowed such injustices to happen in the first place. And though the road ahead would be challenging, Maya felt ready to take it on. With her brother by her side and her community rallying behind her, she knew she had the strength to keep fighting. Not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The day of the community meeting arrived, and Maya stood nervously at the front of a small but packed room in the local library. Chairs had been arranged in neat rows, but they were barely enough to accommodate everyone who showed up. People of all ages filled the space. Parents with young children, elderly neighbors leaning on canes, teenagers scrolling through their phones until the moment began. The air buzzed with quiet conversations, anticipation hanging heavy as Maya adjusted the microphone on the podium. Zeke sat quietly in the back corner, his presence unassuming yet reassuring. He wasn't there to take center stage. This was Maya's moment. Still, knowing he was nearby gave her the confidence she needed to step into the spotlight. She took a deep breath, looked out at the crowd, and began to speak. "I never thought I'd be standing here today," she started, her voice soft but steady. I'm not an activist or a public speaker. I'm just a mom trying to do my best for my kids." A ripple of nods moved through the audience as people leaned forward, drawn in by her honesty. But sometimes life pushes you into situations you didn't ask for. And when that happens, you have two choices: stay silent or speak up. Maya went on to recount what had happened during the traffic stop, the harassment, the baseless accusations, the fear she felt for herself and her children. Her words painted a vivid picture, one that resonated deeply with many in the room. Some nodded knowingly, while others wiped away tears. When she described Zeke's intervention, she made it clear that his actions weren't about flexing power. They were about protecting family and demanding accountability. "But here's the thing," Maya continued, her tone shifting from personal reflection to determination. "Not everyone has a brother like mine. Not everyone has someone who can make sure justice is served. And that's why we need to talk about what happened, not just for me, but for every person who's been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin, where they live, or how much money they make." Her speech struck a chord. As soon as she finished, applause erupted, filling the room with energy. One by one, others stood up to share their own stories. A middle-aged man recounted being stopped repeatedly while driving home from work, always for no reason other than the car he drove. A teenage girl spoke about being followed around a store simply because of how she dressed. An older woman tearfully described watching her son get handcuffed outside their house over a misunderstanding. Each story added another layer to the collective narrative, underscoring the urgent need for change. Zeke watched silently from the back, his expression thoughtful. He knew these moments mattered, not just for raising awareness, but for empowering people to see themselves as agents of change. After the testimonials ended, he stepped forward briefly to address the group. "What Maya and all of you are doing takes courage," he said, his voice carrying the same calm authority that commanded respect everywhere he went. "But remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. Keep speaking up, keep organizing, and keep holding those in power accountable. Change starts here with us." Inspired by the turnout and the raw emotion in the room, Maya and the community leaders decided to take things further. They organized workshops on legal rights, hosted panels featuring activists and lawyers, and even planned a peaceful march through the neighborhood to draw broader attention to their cause. Flyers and social media posts spread the message far beyond their immediate community, attracting support from neighboring towns and cities. As weeks turned into months, the movement gained momentum. Local news outlets picked up the story, amplifying Maya's voice and shining a light on systemic issues within law enforcement. The officers involved in her case faced disciplinary action, and internal reforms were proposed within the police department. While progress was slow and imperfect, it was undeniable. Something was shifting. For Maya, the journey wasn't easy. There were days when doubt crept in, when the weight of advocacy felt overwhelming. But every time she wavered, she remembered the faces in that crowded library. The people who had stood with her, shared their stories, and vowed to fight alongside her. Together, they proved that change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. And though the road ahead would be long, Maya knew she wasn't walking it alone. Months had passed since that fateful night, and Maya's life had transformed in ways she never imagined. What began as a terrifying encounter with law enforcement had evolved into a mission, a calling that gave her purpose beyond her role as a mother and nurse. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving, using her voice to challenge the systems that had once silenced her. Her days were busier than ever, balancing work, parenting, and activism. But for the first time in a long while, she felt truly alive. The community meetings continued, growing larger with each gathering. Neighbors who once kept to themselves now greeted Maya warmly on the street, thanking her for inspiring them to speak out. Young people, especially, gravitated toward her message of resilience and justice. They saw her not just as a victim of circumstance, but as a symbol of strength, a living example of what it meant to turn pain into power. Maya embraced this newfound role, mentoring teens and young adults who wanted to make a difference. "You don't have to wait for someone else to fix things," she often told them. "Change starts with us." Zeke remained a steady presence in her life, offering guidance whenever she needed it. Though he returned to his duties overseas, they stayed connected through regular calls and messages. He encouraged her efforts, reminding her that even small victories mattered. "It's not about changing everything overnight," he'd say. "It's about planting seeds. Someday they'll grow into something bigger than any of us could have imagined." One evening, Maya received an invitation that took her by surprise. She was asked to speak at a citywide rally focused on police reform and racial equality. The event would bring together activists, politicians, and everyday citizens from across the region, all united in their demand for accountability and change. At first, Maya hesitated. Speaking to a few dozen neighbors was one thing. Addressing thousands of strangers was another. But Zeke's words echoed in her mind. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. With a deep breath, she accepted. On the day of the rally, Maya stood backstage, clutching her notes tightly. The energy of the crowd was electric, a mix of hope and determination pulsing through the air. As she waited for her turn to speak, she glanced around at the diverse faces filling the park. Families holding handmade signs, elderly couples sitting side by side, teenagers chanting slogans in unison. It was a sea of humanity, united by a shared desire for justice. For a moment, Maya felt overwhelmed. Could she really inspire these people? Did her story matter enough? When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage, blinking against the bright lights. The microphone felt heavy in her hands, but as she looked out at the crowd, she found her rhythm. "I'm Maya Johnson," she began, her voice trembling slightly before steadying. "And I'm here because I know what it's like to feel powerless, to be treated as less than human simply because of the color of my skin." Her words flowed naturally, weaving together her personal experience with a broader call to action. She spoke about the night she was pulled over, the fear she felt for her children, and the frustration of needing her brother's intervention to receive fair treatment. But she also talked about hope, the hope she found in her community, in the people standing before her, and in the belief that change was possible if they worked together. By the time she finished, the crowd erupted into cheers, their applause echoing like thunder. Strangers approached her afterward, shaking her hand and thanking her for sharing her story. Some promised to join local advocacy groups. Others vowed to vote in upcoming elections. Maya realized then that her words had planted seeds, just as Zeke had said. Seeds of awareness, courage, and action. In the weeks that followed, the momentum only grew. Local leaders began drafting policies aimed at increasing transparency within law enforcement. Schools hosted discussions about systemic racism, encouraging students to think critically about the world around them. Even some officers attended community forums, listening to concerns and pledging to do better. Progress wasn't perfect, but it was progress nonetheless. For Maya, the journey was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, moments when doubt crept in or fatigue threatened to pull her under. But every time she faltered, she remembered why she started: to create a safer, fairer world for her children and for everyone else's. And with Zeke cheering her on from afar and her community standing beside her, she knew she could face whatever came next. Together, they were proving that even the smallest voices could spark the biggest changes. A year had passed since the night that changed Maya's life forever. The small, quiet woman who once kept her struggles to herself had become a beacon of hope for her community and beyond. Her story, of resilience, courage, and determination, had spread far beyond Chicago, inspiring people across the country. News outlets featured her in interviews, calling her a symbol of grassroots activism. Schools invited her to speak to students about standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible. And though the attention sometimes overwhelmed her, Maya never lost sight of why she started this journey: to ensure no one else would have to endure what she did alone. The changes sparked by her advocacy were undeniable. In her neighborhood, the police department implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. Officers were required to wear body cameras at all times, and independent oversight committees were formed to review complaints of misconduct. While these reforms weren't perfect, they marked a step in the right direction, a testament to the power of collective action. People began to feel a renewed sense of trust in their community, knowing that their voices mattered. For Maya, the most profound impact was closer to home. Her children, now older and more aware of the world around them, looked at their mother with admiration. They saw her not just as a caregiver, but as a fighter, a woman who refused to back down when faced with injustice. "Mom," her eldest son said one evening over dinner, "you're like a superhero." Maya laughed softly, brushing off the compliment, but deep down, she felt a swell of pride. If nothing else, she hoped her actions taught her kids the importance of standing up for themselves and others. Zeke remained her rock throughout it all, checking in regularly, despite his demanding schedule overseas. Their bond had grown stronger through the ordeal, a reminder of how family could anchor you during life's storms. During one of their calls, Zeke told her, "You've done something incredible, Maya. You turned pain into purpose. Not everyone has the strength to do that." His words brought tears to her eyes, not because she sought praise, but because she knew he understood how hard she'd worked to get here. As time went on, Maya continued to balance her roles as a mother, nurse, and advocate. She didn't see them as separate parts of her identity. Instead, they intertwined, each one fueling the other. At work, she became a mentor to younger nurses, encouraging them to use their voices to improve patient care. In her community, she helped organize events that celebrated diversity and unity, bringing neighbors together in ways that once seemed unimaginable. Her days were full, but they were also fulfilling, a stark contrast to the quiet struggle she'd endured before. One crisp autumn morning, Maya stood outside the same park where she'd spoken at the citywide rally months earlier. Today, however, the atmosphere was different. Families gathered under colorful tents, enjoying food, music, and laughter. It was the first annual Community Unity Day, an event Maya had helped plan to celebrate progress while acknowledging there was still work to be done. Children ran around with balloons, couples danced to live music, and volunteers handed out flyers about upcoming initiatives. Everywhere Maya looked, she saw smiles, connection, and hope. As she walked through the crowd, strangers stopped her to thank her. Some shared stories of how her advocacy had inspired them to take action in their own lives. Others simply expressed gratitude for being part of a movement that made them feel seen and heard. Maya listened intently, humbled by their words. She realized then that her journey wasn't just about her. It was about creating a ripple effect, empowering others to believe in their ability to make a difference. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maya found herself sitting on a bench overlooking the festivities. Beside her sat Zeke, home on leave for the first time in months. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the scene unfold before them. Finally, Zeke broke the quiet. "You've built something amazing here, Maya. Something that'll last long after we're gone." Maya smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We did it together," she replied softly. "None of this would have been possible without you, or without everyone else who stood with us." In that moment, surrounded by love, laughter, and the promise of a brighter future, Maya felt a deep sense of peace. Life hadn't been easy, and challenges undoubtedly lay ahead. But she knew one thing for certain. She was stronger than she'd ever believed, and so was the community she'd helped build. Together, they proved that even in the face of adversity, resilience, courage, and unity could light the way forward. And that was a legacy worth fighting for.